Hello all and welcome back to the corner. In the last installment I had built and primed the 1/4 scale DDR cabinet and was ready to paint it, but I didn't. And to explain why, and also why the 3D model I showed you in part 1 is very outdated, I first of all need to head back to Time Warp Arcade. Welcome back to Time Warp Arcade everyone, who for some reason continue to let me abuse their DDR cab. Although if you do want to come down to their arcade, located in Bridgewater, Somerset, be kind to their cabinets. The people who work here do amazing things to keep these games running, so please treat them with respect.
Now the reason for leaving it in primer is two reasons really. One of which is I still need to modify this cab, so painting at this stage didn't make sense. The other reason is when I went into my local paint supplier, they didn't know what Euromix grade was. So together we came up with this chart. And when we line it up to the cab, we can find that U-Pol steel wheels is a close match. So what we need to do is paint it in that colour.
Now that we know what shade of silver to paint the cabinet in, the first task to get on with is to make those modifications. So, let's get started on that. Now what I'm going to do is start by making a little recess under the monitor, and the reason I need to do that is when I eventually put in the channels, and this isn't the right channel, it needs to be bent slightly differently, but when I do, it needs to have a little bit of clearance, just so that when I put the monitor on, it doesn't rest on top of this. And you might be thinking, why don't you just clamp it down over the top of it? And yeah, I could. The issue with doing that is when I do that, you're going to have this gap running along the bottom. But if I wanted to remove the subwoofer, it means I'd have to remove the monitor section first, then I could remove this bit. Whereas if I put a little recess in there, it means what I'll be able to do is slide this part out and quite easily, and then pull the speaker out without having to remove everything on the monitor section. Because you've got to remember there's going to be cables and bolts and other stuff that would be running or connecting this top half to the bottom half. And if you had to do it more than once, it's going to be really annoying to do. So that's what we're going to do. So I should have paid attention when I was cutting my, or putting my staples in, because that's not in a great position. Now I know that it's deep enough. This is, I think they're like 2 or 3 mil deep into the wood is fine, but yeah, I got to be careful of that one. Also, that line doesn't look particularly straight. That's because it's not. Define straight on anything that I've made. As you can see, that was not particularly consistent, and I know exactly why. It's because my setup is just abysmal. There's so much I could improve here, but I'm working with what I've got. So I will use this surface, despite my reservations about it, but what I'll do is I'll have to realign everything now, because yet again, it's the different height and different everything, so yeah. Have these lovely little handles that have been printed. We're going to make the holes to stick them in the sides. Now, the reason I put the handles on is purely aesthetics. You can actually use these handles to lift it up, but they are purely just aesthetic, really. I was tempted to glue them in. I might still do that, but for the moment, I'm just going to cut the holes and then use some self-tapping screws to hold them in. Now, to aid with the installation of said handles, I do have a 1:1 scale printout of where the things should go, and looking at that, it is actually 1:1 for once. And I say that because I've printed out these before and they've actually been like 95% scale for some reason. But anyway, this seems like it'll work fine. So what I'll do is I'm going to cut this out and then we'll go from there. You know, if that's 1:1, I'm really pleased with myself because I've managed to make this cabinet within a couple of mil. Yeah, I'll take that. You know, it's been nearly 2 years since I first started measuring up this dancing stage cabinet and wrote all the measurements down in a book. The first 2 attempts I had made, which I showed in my first part of the series, was the result of me using the first ideas I had and the measurements that I originally took. But after looking at the results and testing the audio, I wasn't happy, and hence they were abandoned. Oh, and because they're a tad horribly built. See, in all the time that I had to think about the project, the more I realised I didn't want to make just a cheap knockoff looking design. I wanted to make this cabinet the best I could. And this direction has culminated in this much newer design, featuring many custom designed parts and pieces. The only problem with that is, well, me. Now there is a saying in the UK about being the jack of all trades and yet the master of none of them. Now I certainly don't mind trying to make every individual part on this project, but I know I lack both the tools and expertise to do this in the standard I want. Part of this also means designing and making custom electronics to fit within the cabinet to allow me to have much better integrated components. So I was entirely grateful when PCB Rave reached out to me asking if they could help out. And after dithering around for some months on PCB designs, I sent them my designs and then they sent me these boards. And honestly, they came out fantastic, and these will be absolutely key in making this mini cab the best it can be. The PCBs will enable me to make this cabinet much tidier on the inside and work in the way I wanted to, not just being a mess of wires, which is one of the reasons I was really excited to make these. Now I'm still waiting on the parts of these PCBs, so I can't build them right now, but I also wanted to show off these 3D printed parts. These were printed by a good friend of mine by the username of TJE. And I want to put a huge thank you out to him for all the time and plastic that I have requested from him and from RichRap 3D as well. Now you may have noticed that these parts have some inserts in them. These are heat set brass inserts for adding machine threads to plastic parts. Now whilst I could have used self-tapping screws to hold some parts together, and in fact I do use some of these for holding the main cabinet handles onto the cabinet body, some other parts like the PCBs might need to be changed multiple times, so for reliability I'm using machine screws instead. The heat sets are installed by using, you guessed it, heat. I set my soldering iron to its lowest temperature of around 200 degrees Celsius, and then using a special heat set tip, I installed these flush with the plastic face and then cut off any excess plastic that spilt out. However, there is still a lot of work to do elsewhere, so let's crack on. That's not right. So this might be one of these things where the printer I use 2 printers when I printed these. These templates I used a HP color laser, and this one I used a Ricoh multifunction copier. You'll notice that this one is about short by 1 millimeter on every side. Now that's one or 2 reasons why I might have done that. For some reason when I printed stuff out it was printing at like 95 or it was printing just less than 1:1 scale. I don't think it's going to matter, but it's interesting to note. I'm still just going to put it right in the center because there's nothing that requires this to be anywhere particular. It just needs to be roughly in the center. every time I try to use a Dremel, it sucks. Every single time I try to use one. So I've just been drilling these holes, and one thing that I hate about using manual drills or something like that is the fact that they'll slowly creep over time. And this is a problem because this is the button set, and the way this works is there's a clamp behind it, and these need to be roughly in the right position, otherwise it's just not going to work. Now, at the moment, it's still centered-ish, but this one's starting to wander to the left. So this has a bit of tolerance because this is the button board and it's mostly complete, except for the way this works is this clamps onto the wood, this goes on the underside of it. Now when you lay them over, the buttons are precisely aligned so that they line up with the holes on the cabinet. So the buttons can be a little off or, you know, on center and it'd be fine. I'm going to use this as well to give me a little bit of a deburring tool afterwards, because this will make a countersunk hole, or at least it'll make a countersunk edge.
After all the holes were drilled, I realised I didn't put any provisions for tolerance in the button housings. So I used CG10's makeshift lathe and a file to shave off around 0.3mm off of the diameter of the button housings to fix this.
And this is why I wanted to do all of this stuff before I painted it, because you can see how some of the primer is coming off and I need to know how much work I actually need to do. But with that out of the way, we should be able to now just click these buttons into place, or at least they slide in quite nicely. And as you notice, they're very tiny. And I'm getting very happy, or giddy I guess, for seeing such tiny things. And then on the back side, this clamp would go in like that, and then it would clamp down on all of them. Like so. Oh, come on, focus. And there we go. And these now, if anything, will be nicely straightened out. Now something I have noticed with this particular paint is that there's some kind of flaky stuff going on in it, and what I mean by that is that quite literally there's flakes. So whilst normally I wouldn't do this, I am going to take a bit of a rag and just go over it just to get rid of the flakes, just because I want an even finish. I don't want a flaky finish, but should be fine really. Now the original cabinet, ignore the missing marquee, uses a 29-inch CRT monitor running about 15 kHz. Now the reason I'm not using a 7-inch CRT in my cabinet is quite simple. It doesn't fit.
Now I also won't be using Konami's 573 in my cabinet for similar sizing reasons, so this Intel NUC will have to do in its place. The large tray has support to take a sled for the NUC, and I'm using a separate sled piece so that if I wanted to change the platform down the line, it's as simple as replacing this sled rather than the entire tray. After all of that, I reattached the exterior furnishings and put the bottom housings in place.
So there we are, the cab is now painted in Euromix grey, plus the screen, cone door frame and handles are installed. Now this episode is already very long, so I'll leave it here for now, but don't worry, the next part will come much sooner than this one has. Although if you have enjoyed this series, then please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Believe me, it has it all. In fact, we will get the minicab into a playable state. And no, it's not like I'm trying to rush finishing this for any particular reason.